All right. If I can figure out how this works, we'll get going. All right. Good morning. How y'all doing? So my name's Shier. I work for Sophos in the office of the CTO. And my job is to look at security as an industry, as opposed to when you think about security companies and researchers, you think about the guys and girls working in labs, right? The people that are actually looking for the bad stuff and then finding ways of protecting against it. And we do have a lot of those people that work in our labs that focus on all sorts of different areas of the threat. And we do that as well in my group. But what we also do is we kind of peel back a little bit and try to have just a better view of the entire landscape and how is security impacting our partners, our customers, and the general public at large. And this talk kind of came out of that. It's more of an area of interest. I did a talk last year about how to become a cyber criminal just by jumping on the dark web and trolling around and seeing what you could find, right? And out of that, it was right around the time that the AlphaBay seizure had happened, and it was kind of a side note to the story, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, let's dive into that, and this is really about some of the wins as a security industry that we've had with respect to taking down some of these criminals in specifically on the dark web. And so I wanted to tell that story because I think we hear a lot about the losses, we hear a lot about the negative stuff when we go to security conferences. It's kind of fun to just look back and see, what happens when we win and what are we doing about it. So we're going to specifically talk about things like AlphaBay and Hansa today and some of the Darknet markets that are out there. And I'll explain along the way how these markets work, because I think some people just don't kind of get the whole economics of it. So we'll explore that a little bit. And what's fun about doing some of this research is when you have a focused topic in mind, you're like, hey, I'm going to talk about this, and it'll be really fun. And then stuff happens. And you've got to sort of take a left or a right turn. And that happened while I was doing this research. So what the talk's not going to be about, though, is I'm not going to go into any of the moral and ethical implications of the dark web and the darknet markets and all the drugs and weapons and all that kind of stuff that are available on there. We can talk about that afterwards. But we're really here to just talk about the darknet markets themselves and then what happens when security researchers and law enforcement start to poke around and seeing what they can find. So before we get to that part, we need to take a couple detours, and that's really, we need to go to the beginning or near the beginning and talk about how we came to be with the darknet and these darknet markets. And the first one we really need to talk about is Silk Road. So as many of you probably remember, Silk Road was probably the first massively successful darknet market out there. It was founded in 2011 by Ross Ulbricht, who's now in custody. And he's very much a libertarian mindset. So they had these the philosophy of agorism and counter economics and all these fancy terms. Like, he was out there saying, listen, you can come to these markets and get the goods and services you want without the government interfering in your business, and they don't have any business in there anyway. So I'm going to provide that service for you as a as a person who's looking out for you, right? That's kind of the whole idea behind agorism and counter economics. And Silk Road, it wasn't the first darknet market out there, but it was the first one to gain a lot of popularity within the customer base, if you will, the people that were going around the dark web. And it actually helped to sort of guide and provide a blueprint for how a lot of the markets then on performed, architected themselves. And one of the things that it did was it was a very early adopter of the escrow system. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And it also introduced something called the vendor reputation system. So, we're very familiar, at least on the Defender side, about reputation, right? So URL reputation, those kinds of things. They were doing the same sort of idea with vendors on the dark web in those days. And one pretty notable aspect of Silk Road was the policy that only goods and services which didn't harm or defraud, and that was in the terms of service, were allowed on the site. So, this applied to things like child sexual exploitation material, services based on violence of any kind, and goods used to aid and abet fraud, right? So carding services, stolen identities, those kinds of things. So those were not allowed. Now, it wasn't always the case. Obviously, some stuff snuck onto the market from time to time, but at least that's what the terms of service stated. And in keeping with that libertarian ethos of do no harm to others, you can do all the harm you want to yourself, but do no harm to others. It focused mostly on drugs and drug paraphernalia. That was the site's sort of reason for being. And there weren't only illegal goods available on Silk Road at the time. You had things like jewelry, books, artwork, sports memorabilia, and war memorabilia as well. So you've got some replicas for some war memorabilia here as well. And what Silk Road also, what it also brought to the table was this helping bring Bitcoin to popularity, if you will, right? So before then, a lot of the markets were, and there's one called the Farmers Market, which was around just before Silk Road. It actually transacted in PayPal and Western Union, and that's actually what led to its downfall. And if you look at some of the other takedowns of things like fake AV and the police lockers, they were also using sort of more common payment methods. And by following the money, it's easier for the feds and law enforcement to basically find out who these people are. But Silk Road was the early adopter of Bitcoin, and it was Bitcoin only at the time. And the large transaction volume that was happening on Silk Road market at the time helped actually pump up the Bitcoin price. And then if we look at the chart here, which is right over here in the middle, is when Silk Road was seized, and you can see there was a brief but very sharp drop in Bitcoin value on that day. And that was just because there was this massive volatility in the market all of a sudden, and then Bitcoin plunged. Now, it wasn't very long-lived. The Bitcoin price, it recovered, but it didn't take long for other people, other criminals to realize, like, this is a market that they want to get in on. This is, they want to be part of this action. So the next thing we need to talk about is how these darknet markets actually work. Some of the markets that are around today, actually most of the markets are around today, actually still follow the original ethos of Silk Road. They trade, at least they attempt to trade in only drugs and drugs paraphernalia and anything that doesn't pose harm to others. You have some markets out there that are all over the place, but the majority of the more popular markets today, they'll just sell about anything to anyone. They really don't care. So drugs, weapons, hacking services, malware, counterfeit goods, you name it, even murder for hire services, some of them, if most of those are scams. But the only thing that most of these markets still prohibit is anything to do with child sexual exploitation. And sometimes murder. They're a little bit vague on that one. But how do these things operate? So this is Government Exhibit 113A from the Ross Ulbricht trial. And it really gives us a good, clear picture about how these markets operate. So you've got vendors that have a product. They will place an ad on the market. And then you've got your buyers on the left-hand side. Now, the buyers, the first thing they need to do is they take their real money and translate it to fake money. And then they go and browse the dark web market for something they want, right? So let's say it's drugs. So they'll go and find an ad. They'll click on the ad. And then once they put in their buy order, they transfer some of those Bitcoins, whatever the value of the ad is for that good, into what's called an escrow account. Now, these escrow accounts are how they attempt to build trust within these markets. So I'm not just going to give my money directly to the person who's selling me the drugs because he could just take my money and run, right? So what these escrow accounts do is they hold the money until the goods or services have been delivered. So until you can signal to the market that, yes, I've received what it is I'm looking for, the vendor doesn't get any money. And where the markets themselves make money is they just take a cut. They take a commission by brokering that transaction in the middle. And it's usually somewhere from 2 to 6%. So that's really how they make their money. They're a facilitator, and they just take a cut along the way as the goods and services flow through. Now, there's other ways of making money as well. There are actually rules if you want to become a vendor on a dark web market, and you've got to follow them. And there's the usual rules specifically around things like no child sexual exploitation material, murder for hire services, and also no doxing. That's a big one which is kind of funny on the dark web. Everything's supposed to be anonymous and private. And so these dark web markets, like, they go, if you dox somebody, if you reveal somebody's home address and their private details, you're pretty much banned from any markets for life. until you get another identity and get back in there again. And then Empire, which is one of the markets that's out there right now, actually charges a fee to get on. So there's a vendor bond you can see sort of underlined there, $300, which is non-refundable. So Empire Market, they just say, basically we want only serious vendors on here. So you got to put a little skin in the game, $300, not that much. But they're trying to keep scammers away. And for them, securities is a top priority. Like you have to have a PGP key and you must enable 2FA on your accounts on the market if you want to become a vendor. So they're doing that not only to protect themselves, but really to protect the buyers that are coming to these darknet markets. And, that begs the question, like, could you imagine if like Facebook and some of these other social services had these kinds of rules as well? We might be in a better place. There's another market out there right now called Nightmare, and they have very similar rules. They only charge a $250 bond for new vendors, but they will refund that fee after 3 months if you've got what they call a 100% fair dealing rating. So if nobody complains about your service, you haven't doxed anybody, you've delivered all your goods on time and it's the right amount, then they will refund that $250. But the number one rule for this particular market, though, is that there's no shenanigans against Russian citizens. So number one at the very top. And they feel really adamant about this because they actually mentioned it twice, right? So I wonder where these guys are operating out of. And then finally, there's other creative ways that some of these markets generate funds. This is from Empire Market. It used to operate. It's no longer, the lottery it used to operate is no longer around. But basically, it was just that. It was a lottery. You buy the equivalent of $1 through Bitcoins. You get into the lottery, and then you take your chance at winning. At the time, it was $8K for the jackpot, right? And that's just it. It was just a money-making scheme, and I don't know why they took it down. There's never been any sort of blog post about it, but it doesn't operate anymore. All right. So why do these things get shut down? Why do they come and go? This is an eye chart. I get it, but the colors are what we're looking for here. So this is 87 markets that were tracked over 6 years, and the colored bar indicates why it was shut down, and then the length of the bar indicates the length of time that it operated, right? So I've drawn some lines there to just connect them for you. It doesn't matter. I'll tell you what the names are on the left-hand side here. But basically, at the top of the chart, we can see, at the very top of the chart, we can see Silk Road 1, which is in green. And green means that it was taken down by law enforcement. So that means any kind of law enforcement action is going to get coded green on this chart. And then after that, you see something called Black Market Reloaded, which is the very next line, which is coded in gold. And that means that they allegedly suffered some sort of a hack and then forced them to take it down. And you see that from time to time, and there's a big DDoS thing happening on Tor right now with a lot of these markets, and sometimes the markets just kind of go away because they can't be bothered to deal with this kind of stuff. And then Sheep Market, which is, again, the next one down, which is in blue, that means they exit scammed. So an exit scam is where the administrators of the market, we talked about that escrow account where all the funds go into it, right, and they don't get released until there's the buy order has been satisfied. An exit scam is very simply where the administrators of the market go, thank you very much, and walk away with all the funds. And this happens quite often, and it's happened quite a few times in the last sort of 6 years where markets just take your money and run. Why not? I mean, these are criminals, right? They're operating a criminal enterprise, so in the case of these guys, they took off with $6 million, right? So depending on the size of the market and the amount of transaction volume that's going into that escrow account, it depends on how much stuff you're going to have in there. And then shortly after Silk Road 1 was raided, there was a Silk Road 2 that opened up shop because it was opened up by a moderator of the former Silk Road 1, and they were just using the term for marketing purposes, right? Everybody knew who Silk Road was. It was all over the news, so they thought, oh, we'll just use that. And it lasted about a year before law enforcement took them down. And then the pinky purple one is for markets that voluntarily shut down. So in contrast to things like exit scams, right? These guys actually, they decided to shut down for whatever reason. Maybe the feds were knocking at their door, or they were getting too close. And what they do is they'll post a message on their market saying, we are going to be shutting down. We're going to give you a week to take your funds out of escrow, both the vendors and the buyers, right? and everybody kind of walks away with all their money and their reputation intact, if you will. And Agora was one of these markets. And then finally, there's Evolution, which is the last line that I've highlighted here in blue again. And they exit scammed to the tune of $12 million. So you can see as time goes on, these markets are gaining more traction, more popularity, and more transaction volume. And Agora and Evolution were in their time two of the biggest and most popular markets on the dark web. And just as with nature, which abhors a vacuum, the dark web also follows that same ethos. So when Evolution and Agora went away, you needed something to take its place, and this is really the moment that AlphaBay was waiting for. In the 3 days following Evolution's closure, AlphaBay gained 18,000 new members, and it was soon trading about $300,000 a day. So it was really ramping up and taking a lot of the customers away from these other markets. And it was like a lot of the new, all the other newer markets out there. It dealt in drugs, but you could also get yourself digital goods like these compromised air miles accounts. If you ever wondered, like if you get fished for your Delta Sky Miles account, where it goes, it very much ends up in places like this. Not all the time, but this is a good place for it. And then you got luxury goods like all these Yeezys. Now, when I was doing this research, I'm an old guy. I had no idea what a Yeezy was until I found this. Yeah, you're shaking. Yeah, you're nodding. But anyways, apparently it's sneakers. So, but because of the explosive growth of this particular market, it started drawing a lot of law enforcement attention, right? They saw this flood of people going to this market, and because of the amount of drugs that were transacting, it really needed to be shut down. And so the cops kind of went to work and said, all right, we need to figure out who this person is or these people are that are behind this AlphaBay market. And there were mentions all over the site. If you dug through, ViewSource and other places in the market, that it was founded, designed, and maintained by an individual by the name of Alpha02. Alpha02 also did an interview with a website called Deep.web where he admitted to being the site's founder and owner. And so the cops now had a target, Alpha02, but they really didn't know who the real-life identity of that person was. So they started buying drugs from the market, trying to figure out what they could deduce from any of the shipments or the transactions, right? So they ordered some marijuana and some heroin, and then some more heroin and some more marijuana and some meth as well. And then they ordered some stolen driver's licenses. They ordered some ATM skimmer stuff. But nothing came out of all of this. They couldn't really get any kind of clues. And it wasn't until they decided to register an account on the discussion forum that they caught a break. Now, most of these markets do have discussion forums that are attached to them, so they'll have the main market and then the discussion forum. And generally, you have to register for both. And so that's what they did. They registered for an account. Now, one of the features of the sign-up process is that when you're creating an account, you had to provide an email address, and this was for password recovery. So forgot my password, it would email you a link to reset. And when the system sent that automated email, in the headers of that welcome email saying, thank you for registering, there was an address. So pimpalex91@hotmail.com. So that was included in the header. So the feds basically just called up Microsoft and said, hey, who's this clown, right? And it turned out that this was a Canadian, one of my fellow countrymen, apparently, named Alexandre Caz, whose birth date was 19 October 1991. So, if you look at his LinkedIn profile, it indicated that he was a software designer based in Quebec that worked for a company called EBX Technologies. This is a company that the law enforcement eventually learned he actually owned and controlled. And EBX Technologies was really just a front company that he used to launder all of the AlphaBay money through. And if you look, because they started looking at things like government taxation records and all sorts of other financial things, and the company wasn't particularly productive or successful, but it was very good at laundering money. So they also found mentions of that Hotmail address and an EBX Technologies address associated with a PayPal account. So what these are, in case you're wondering, is these are all just snippets from the indictment of Alexandre Caz. And this is if you're doing research like this is a really good way to figure out how stuff went down. Because law enforcement won't really tell you what's going on during an investigation, but when the indictment comes out, you can find out a lot of information. So, So they found this PayPal account, and then if you dig even further, you find a post on a French computer help forum, like a bleeping computer style forum that was dedicated to French Canadians and French-speaking people. And there was a post by a user, Alpha02. And this might have been a coincidence, right? Because anybody could pick that username. If it hadn't been for the fact that he actually signed the post, Alexandre Cause, and had his email address, pimpalex91@hotmail.com, at the bottom of the post. Actually, if you go to this, you can still find this post today, but for some reason the site's actually scrubbed that last bit where he signed his name for whatever reason. And then if you do like most people, when you get an email address, you go check, have I been pwned, right? And of course, his address was leaked all over the place, just like the rest of our addresses, right? So it was in the LinkedIn breach, as most of us are, but it's also in something called 000 Web Host, which is a well-known repository for very shady web scripts. So he was participating in that community as well, and no doubt probably using it for some of his other side gigs as well. So ironically, in the Deep.Web interview that I mentioned earlier, he actually bragged about his OPSEC, right? I am absolutely certain that my OPSEC is secure and I live in an offshore country where I'm safe. Hubris will always take you down. So at this point, the feds, they had the individual in question. It was just now time to take him down. Around that same time period, there was another market called Hansa, which was getting a lot of attention, both from the users, basically, the amount of popularity it had, if you will, and again, law enforcement. And like AlphaBay and again, many of the other markets out there, it dealt with all sorts of illegal goods and services, drugs, counterfeit items, stolen digital information, like these Netflix accounts. Again, if you're ever wondering where your Fish, Spotify, Netflix account end up, it's over here. And one day in late 2016, a security researcher was just kind of trolling around the web and found something interesting. They found a server on the clear web that appeared to be a development server for the Hansa market. Okay, so that's interesting. So the researcher then looked at the IP address, and it looked like it was located in the Netherlands, so he notified the Dutch police, and they started getting to work. Now, the Dutch High-Tech Crimes Unit, or HTCU, you might hear me say that, they quickly got a warrant, went to the data center, installed a network tap, and they wanted to see the traffic that was coming to and from this server. And to their surprise, they found that the development server was actually really, really chatty. It was communicating with Tor-protected servers in the same data center as that was hosting the Hansa live site as well. So we're starting to see some OPSEC breakdowns here, and also a couple of other servers in Germany. So the HTCU immediately made a copy of all of these servers, all the ones they could get their hands on, and what was on those servers was every transaction record and that the site had ever done to that point, and the entire conversation history of the anonymized chat system. And since all the conversations in those chat systems usually use pseudonyms, it wasn't really possible to determine exactly who all the individuals were in real life that were chatting. But again, OPSEC mistakes will always take you down. And so in one very old chat log, as they were scrolling towards the bottom, they found both admins' full names, like legitimate names, and the home address of one of these guys. So they went to the German authorities, because they had a couple servers in there, and these were German individuals, and they said, hey, we need to have these guys arrested and extradited, and the Germans said, hey, we know who those guys are. Apparently, it turns out that they were already under investigation by the German authorities for running a site that was called lul.to, and this was basically selling pirated ebooks, audiobooks, and MP3s. And when the Dutch police found this out, they thought, well, okay, well, maybe we can use the arrest of these guys for lul.to to kind of spring a trap for another operation that we're thinking about. And it was, unfortunately, at this time, the Dutch were just getting ready to put this whole operation into motion that everything went dark. All communication stopped. Now, the assumption here is that the people behind this particular set of servers, this particular operation, this market, they had noticed something funny going on. They noticed the hard drive copy, or they noticed something that wasn't quite right. And so they basically turned everything off and then moved their servers elsewhere. So now this kind of left the HTCU with nothing. They didn't know where these guys had gone. and it was basically back to analyzing what they had, which was the transaction records and the chat logs. And luckily, as they were going through the chat logs, they found in April 2017, they found a Bitcoin wallet that was buried in one of the chats. Using some blockchain analysis, they found that this Bitcoin wallet was, they found that the payment was made through a provider that was located in the Netherlands to another provider in Lithuania. And so they got a warrant issued, they went to Lithuania, and basically they found the Hansa servers once again. So this is actually one of the servers in the racks. Okay, so now they got their people again, and this sort of big break, okay, we can carry on with our operation. And at this time, the FBI came over and notified the HTCU, because a lot of these guys work together in the back end, that they had also found the servers hosting AlphaBay. So you've got the Dutch, they've got control of Hansa, or at least they know where Hansa is, and then now you've got the FBI saying, we know who AlphaBay is, who the founder is, and who the operator is. And so they were planning to take AlphaBay down, and they were just notifying the Dutch as a courtesy. And this gave the Dutch another idea. They figured that if AlphaBay went down, then, as happened many times in the past with all the other markets, the users will flood somewhere else, and the likely destination for these guys was the Hansa market, because Hansa was number 2, AlphaBay was number 1. So on 20 June 2017, the Dutch police sent a couple of agents to Lithuania, and the Germans sent the police to the homes of the 2 individuals that were running the Hansa market, and basically, in a very coordinated dawn raid, they basically broke into the homes of these 2 guys, busted down the doors, as the guys in Lithuania were doing hard drive copies of those servers. And it turns out that under questioning, once these guys, they got them to the police station, they basically just handed over all the credentials, all the PGP keys. Yeah, it's us. Have at it. And the interesting thing was there was a zero downtime for any of this, because the Dutch cops had taken a copy of that server and then spun it up immediately in a Dutch data center that they controlled, and then did the cutover without anybody noticing. And that's when all the pieces for Operation Bayonet was born. And on 5 July 2017, the FBI, with the help of authorities in Canada and Thailand, they shut down AlphaBay. Now, the Canadian authorities took down the servers because they were actually being hosted in Montreal at the time. And the Thai police went and arrested Alexandre Kaz at his residence in Bangkok. So this is a picture of one of his homes. Now, the Thai police, this was interesting. They used an unmarked car to stage a disturbance outside of his residence. What they did was they backed this car up into his front gate, and hoping that he would notice that something had happened out in the street, and that he would come outside because they needed to get him. And nothing happened. So then they had some other undercover officers, shouting in Thai and making a commotion. They moved the car and they rammed it in his gate again. And eventually there was enough commotion that he came running out of his house to discover, to figure out what was going on. And that's when they swooped in, basically tackled him to the ground. Apparently he was talking on the phone, and he was shirtless, wearing flip-flops. They tackled him, they grabbed his phone, they ran upstairs. And when they got to his computer, he was actually, the session was open and unlocked, and he was logged into the AlphaBay servers because he was trying to figure out what the heck is going on, because his servers were starting to come down. So they kind of had him red-handed. Now, meanwhile, in the Netherlands, this is where it gets really fun and interesting, is the Dutch police were fiddling with all the code on Hansa. They rewrote the site's code so that it would no longer store the passwords of users in hashes, but as just plain text. So they were able to do, basically get all the passwords they could get their hands on that way. Every time you logged in, they would get your password. They also made a change to the messaging system, the encrypted messaging system, so that before all the messages went into the encrypted part of the system, they would just take a copy, a plain text copy. So again, they could see all the identities. They also messed with a code that stripped out all the metadata from photos. So every time somebody uploaded a photo, a vendor uploaded a photo of their drugs or their illicit goods or whatever, the system would strip out the metadata, all the geolocation, that kind of stuff. Well, they changed that so they would keep that in. They actually staged a server glitch forcing resellers. So they basically took down all the pictures, said, oh, we had a server glitch, we lost all the images, can you re-upload stuff? after they turned off that metadata stripping function. So now they were able to, because of that, they could get basically the coordinates of 50 dealers that were re-uploading their pictures. And then they also tricked a bunch of these vendors into downloading an Excel file that was booby-trapped, and it was posing as a backup key for their accounts. And so when they brought that file in and opened it up, what it actually did was just it pinged home, but through their ClearNet addresses as opposed to their Tor-protected circuits. And this got them another 64 targets. So shutting down AlphaBay actually had the desired effect. More than 5,000 users were registering on Hansa every single day after Hansa was shut down. And a week later, once the news broke that AlphaBay actually was taken down by the police, the influx of users was so much on Hansa that they actually had to shut down new registrations. So I was actually just doing my rounds and, going, let's see what's on Hansa today. And I saw this. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. They're shutting down registration. I wonder what that's about. And, as a person not part of law enforcement, I didn't know that it was being controlled by law enforcement at the time. Now, and the reason they did this was because, unfortunately, Dutch law states that you have to track and report every single transaction that goes through Hansa or any kind of, in one of these sting operations. If you're operating in an illegal market or an illegal venture, you have to track and report everything that goes through it. And these guys were dealing with 1,000 transactions a day minimum. So they had to do the paperwork on 1,000 transactions. And after like 27 days, they just couldn't manage it anymore. So they had to shut the site down. So that's when, we got the takedown notice for Hansa. And the results were fairly staggering. The police obtained data on about 420,000 users of the combined sites, if you will, including 100,000 home addresses of real-life people that were both buyers and sellers. And they basically just turned all this over to Europol and other law enforcement agencies worldwide. And they also seized about $12 million worth of Bitcoins in the escrow accounts at that time. They actually did a bunch of what they call knock-and talks at that time. So basically, because they got people's home addresses, people that maybe had ordered drugs, they kind of went over there and said, hey, we know you ordered something, cut it out. We're not going to press charges, but stop it. And by the time it was seized, AlphaBay had over 370,000 listings, 400,000 members, and was trading about $600,000 to $800,000 a day. So a really big operation. Now, in its heyday, Silk Road, just for comparison, had only 13,000 listings, and these guys had 370,000. And it's estimated that AlphaBay grossed about $1 billion in roughly the 2 years that was in operation, which basically was funding a good life for Alexander Kaz. This is in the forfeiture document. You can find out all the stuff that he amassed, and this is one of his luxury villas in Thailand, which you could actually stay at for a time. If you go to the rental agencies now, this is not available for rent anymore, but basically he was buying luxury properties all over the world, and he was trying to become an economic citizen in many countries, which is basically if you buy a certain amount of property or real estate in a country, then they will give you a passport. And so he was doing that in select locations around the world. If only he had been at that earlier talk that I was talking about becoming a Darknet criminal, he would have realized that he shouldn't have gone to any of the blue countries because those are the ones that have extradition treaties with the U.S. In addition to his luxury properties, he had lots of very fancy cars, including this Aventador LP 700. And his personal net worth, according to the Excel spreadsheet they found on his computer, was about $23 million. So that's in property, cash, Bitcoin, and all other assets. Now, this is all good news. We get to shut down some of these markets. Unfortunately, the good news is quite tainted because while he was waiting extradition to the U.S. in Thailand, he hung himself in his Bangkok jail cell. So it's one of these cases where he probably felt the weight of the world crashing down on him, and he couldn't handle it. And unfortunately, he took his own life. So with AlphaBay and Hansa gone, it was Dream's turn to take the spotlight. And basically, when those two markets went away, Dream was number 3. It inherited all of this information, or all the users. And when I was starting to put together the pitch, this is where I was talking about how things happen. I was doing some research. I was doing my regular rounds, and I saw this notice that basically the market was shutting down, and that that was it. We didn't know. The alleged owner and operator, Speed Stepper, the rumor was that he either been arrested or exit scammed. Those are basically the two things that happen on a Darknet forum. A bunch of people vouched for him, said, no, take him at his word. He is just stepping away for a minute. And little red flags started popping up because he wasn't PGP signing his messages. So again, I thought, well, maybe the law enforcement have him. They just don't have his, he hasn't given up his password yet to this PGP key, so that's why they didn't sign it. But the site stayed up. The only thing was all the products were gone. So if you went to the site, you could log in, as I did here, but there were no more ads on the site anymore. You couldn't search for anything. Now, apparently, you could still withdraw your Bitcoins from the escrow account at this point, but some people were saying that there were some issues with that as well. So, there was a lot of, there's just a lot of turmoil, and people weren't sure what was going on. And then 30 April came and went, and basically the site was still showing the same message. And then in May, there was a post on Reddit, which is basically Reddit for the dark web, that basically said they were trying to set the record straight. What they said is that the market had been under sustained DDoS attack and that the attackers were demanding a $400,000 ransom. And this is not new. I've mentioned it earlier. DDoS, because of the way the protocol works, you can actually launch a DDoS attack fairly effectively, to the point that the people behind some of these markets, a lot of the cyber criminals that are operating here, actually are funding. They're funding the one, basically CVE, the one, the bug tracker code that is going to fix this. They started piling a whole bunch of money and begging the Tor project to fix it. But so it's a systemic issue. But basically, instead of giving up and paying the ransom, they just said, we're going to shut down, improve the code, we're going to harden it, and then we're going to make it bigger and better than before. And then another notice happened right after that saying, okay, we're going to come back in August with new infrastructure. And another post on Reddit confirmed that this was going to be the case. And as of now, all the mirrors are gone, and we don't know what the heck happened to Dream. And it's still, well, actually, we kind of know what happened to Dream. There's another market called Samsara that opened up just very recently, which we all assume is where Dream infrastructure moved to. But basically, at the time when I was looking at this, I was like, I was going to talk all about Dream and how it got taken down, and I had nothing. And then I was just, again, doing the rounds, and I saw something really interesting. Valhalla and Wall Street Market were both taken down. The German National Police took down Wall Street Market. Finnish Customs and French Police took down Valhalla. So Wall Street Market and Valhalla now were the up-and-comers in the darknet market world. And you can see how this just keeps moving from one market to the next as people are being shut down and moving around and exit scamming. And this really rocked the dark web community because, again, these markets, the biggest, most popular ones, were being seized. And only 5 days later, after those two seizures occurred, the FBI, didn't want to be left out of the fun, so they seized a very popular dark web news site called Deep.web. Now, it was easy to understand why Wall Street and Valhalla got taken down because they were markets, but what's the deal with Deep.web? Well, prior to being shut down, it was a news site that dealt with all things dark web, and it focused a lot on dark web or darknet market activity. It wasn't just a news site, but it also kind of served as a portal to darknet markets. So if you look on the right-hand side, that's just basically a status of all the popular markets and their availability at the time. And then it also had referral links, so this is for Dream Market specifically, for each of these markets. And so this was the bridge between, if you didn't know, how to get on a dark web market, you'd go here first, and then it would tell you what's the onion link and how you get on and all this kind of thing. But these referral links, as you can see with well, you can't see, but it says AI equals 1675. That was their vendor ID, if you will, the referral ID. What it doesn't explain, though, is, okay, why did they take down Deep.web? Because it was just a news site, and yeah, it pointed to the dark web, but it kind of left a lot of us kind of scratching our heads. Now, as part of the press release, the FBI published this really handy infographic which explains exactly how Deep.web was implicated and why all this stuff was illegal. So the admins would create an account on each of the sites that they were monitoring and representing, and then they would publish the referral links. Every time you open an account, you get a referral link. I have many of them from all the accounts that I have on these darknet markets. And then what they would do is they would take that referral link, as we just saw, put it on their Clear website. And so if you as a user use that referral link to then create your own account on the dark web, on that particular market, what they would then do is they would receive a cut of all the transactions that you ever did in perpetuity. So now we have basically the link, right? So they're receiving what I believe they call proceeds of crime from this referral activity. And then finally, they would launder the stuff through shell companies that they were using to take their bitcoins and translate it back to real money. So according to the indictment of Deep.Web, the referral link was associated with about 24% of all AlphaBay transactions and almost 50%, so 47% of all Hansa transactions. So they were doing a very brisk business. They received over $15 million in kickback payments in total from all the various markets that they were referring. And I think this is the first time that a clear website was actually taken down because of its association with cyber criminals and dark web markets. Now, interestingly, there were a bunch of sites like Deep.Web at the time which were doing this exact same thing, and most of them have since disappeared from the clear web. So I guess they learned their lesson. So, like many of the predecessors of all these takedowns, a slew of OPSEC mistakes were to blame for the takedowns of both Wall Street Market and Deep.Web. There's not a lot of public information on Valhalla. It's starting to come out. I have since found a couple indictments on Valhalla that are starting to explain how that happened, but at the time we didn't have that information. But it really doesn't take much to bring your whole criminal world crumbling down. So the Deep.Web indictment identified Tal Prihar and Michael Phan as the admins of the site. And basically the cops just, again, followed the money to identify these guys and just used a bit of open source intelligence. And so by watching some wallets, doing some blockchain analysis, they were able to see how this money was being transferred between Deep.Web and some of the other properties that these guys owned. And really, what's funny is if you look at the just simple, again, OSINT, right, open source intelligence, you go to LinkedIn, you can find the two profiles for these guys, and you've got Tal Prihar here, who's the owner of BizTech and M&T Marketing, and then Michael Phan, who's the owner at Jazz Coffee Trade Limited. But then if you go look at the Facebook page of Michael Phan, you can see he also lists himself as an owner in the side there of M&T Marketing. So the little pieces start to come together. And they had identified through this blockchain analysis, through following the money, the cops had identified OTSR and M&T Marketing as the companies that were laundering money for Deep.Web. So there you go. So you're broadcasting to the world that you're the owner of these companies and you're also using for criminal proceeds. So starting with these shell companies, basically that's how they were able to get them to the Deep.Web admins. Another good example of how these OPSEC mistakes happen is the story of a senior dream market administrator who was arrested in the U.S. on his way to a beard growing competition. Oxy Monster was a very prominent member of the dream community. He was also a forum admin and a vendor. And his identity was actually pieced together quite interestingly by analyzing public posts on Instagram and Twitter from an individual by the name of Gal Valerius, and they compared these posts. So he's probably already on their radar, and they compared these posts to the Dream Forums post of an individual by the name of Oxy Monster, and basically just looking at the grammar and the syntax of all these messages, they were able to start putting together some clues. Where it really started to go wrong is when the feds were able to associate this Bitcoin wallet address, which was a tip jar on Dream, to a person named Gal Valerius. So a tip jar is basically just what it sounds like. If you feel that the vendor provided excellent service, your drugs came on time and maybe gave you a little extra, you could tip him in Bitcoins for the service that they rendered. And so this was associated with Gal Valerius, and then on 31 August, he was actually detained on his in Atlanta on his way to the competition in Texas. And the indictment states that during the search, they found on his laptop, they found login creds for the Dream website and an encryption key tied to Oxy Monster were both found on his laptops. It's like these guys have never heard of Tails or like burner laptops, right? They just keep this stuff all sitting right there on their laptops. Now, Gal Valerius, he was subsequently tried and found guilty of distributing drugs and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. but you got to admit, it's a pretty sick beard. He might have won. You never know, right? So as of April last year, Wall Street market was basically one of the biggest markets out there. It had 5,400 vendors, over 1 million customers, and like all the other markets, basically, it was taking a cut of all the transactions that were going through it. And Wall Street market was also apparently the successor to German Plaza market, which exit scammed in 2016. And so by using, again, blockchain analysis, so those of you that are still under the impression that blockchain is anonymous, well, it's not. We can find you. They were able to associate funds that were used in the German Plaza market with wallets that were being associated with Wall Street. So this bust is still relatively new, but again, the indictments kind of give us some clues as to what went down in this particular activity. The police discovered that several servers that were thought to belonging to Wall Street, they found these servers on the ClearNet, and then they started imaging them and searching through them for clues, just like the Dutch had done with the HGCU. And there weren't any immediate smoking guns in the data, but they actually found some pseudonyms that they were later able to tie back to the defendants, in this case, who are behind this. Like if you're going to use a pseudonym on the dark web, if you're going to do illegal activity, don't reuse this stuff on the clear web. Like, don't use it for your Facebook or your Twitter account. Now, the authorities were also able to analyze some network traffic and get some additional clues. And in one case, so there's 3 defendants. His VPN connection actually betrayed him when it would drop periodically and unmask his real-world IP. So he wasn't using a very good VPN, because most of the ones that have that security kill switch, they won't do that to you. But basically, he dropped, and he was actively using the Wall Street market infrastructure. And it turns out that the address was associated with a mobile UMTS device, which was registered in a fictitious name, but basically they just surveilled the stick. Every time the stick lit up, they figured out it lit up in 2 places. It lit up in this residential address, and it lit up in this corporate address. Well, probably home and work, right? So just doing some good old gumshoe and detective work and surveillance, they basically found this guy. One of the other guys, his VPN service was actually registered in the name of his mother. So the cops just went to the house and questioned her, and then basically he later just said, yep, it was me. I was running WSM. And then looking at the images, turned up some PGP keys, and these PGP keys were associated with a wallet that was used to pay for some digital marketing services, right? So maybe they were actually paying for ads on deep.web, for example, or some of these other places that were letting you advertise. So basically, looking at that, they were able to piece together that these PGP keys were actually associated with a person by the name of Klaus Martin Frost at web.de. So Klaus Martin Frost being the real web identity, or the real world identity of the 3rd Wall Street market admin. So OPSEC mistakes all over the place. But what's really interesting is that these guys were actually planning an exit scam when the cops started looking at the servers, and a bunch of people actually started noticing. If you look on Reddit, basically it says here, like, we can tell they're exit scamming, and we're now sure that the law enforcement have the IP addresses and usernames for the admin panel. How did they know that? Because some guy posted his username and password to the admin panel of Wall Street Market on Reddit. And we weren't sure at this point who had done that and why until the indictment came out. And this guy is a treasure trove of OPSEC failure. You kind of almost feel sorry for him because he just really wanted to be part of this community. And so this is a guy by the name of Marcos Paulo de Oliveira Anibali, and he was a WSM mod and also a subreddit mod for WSM. He spoke English and Portuguese, and apparently he had interacted with the Dutch police on Hansa. This is him actually having a conversation with the Hansa, the Dutch police, basically. What they were looking for is they just wanted to find out his real-world address, and he was like, no, I can't really give that away, because they were trying to get him a security, like an RSA security token or something to log onto the website. They were going to mail him something, and he's like, no. But it's funny, he basically says, I don't give my address to the police because I trust you guys, right? So if you start digging into this particular individual, you can see that he had a Twitter account by the name of Darknet Citizen. He had a GitHub account under the name of Coins of Pixel, and he had a custom PGP key that was registered to Marcos at marcosanibali.com. If you go look at his GitHub account, you can see it's also associated with Coins of Pixel over here. Oops, did I go too far? No. All right, he had this personalized Bitcoin address of one Marcos blah, 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 right? That was also registered, as I said, to marcosanibali.com. He had a Reddit account that used the same name as his Twitter handle, and he also had a Keybase proof for Marcos Anibali. You could go to MSDN and find Marcos Anibali, coinsofpixel.com as well. So this guy just basically spread his information far and wide and confused everything. And just to make matters worse, he had a Flickr account and a Disqus account that was also in that name. If you look at one of his prior employment, if you go to the Wayback Machine, you can find a page that lists a Marcos Anibali who was a customer feedback supervisor. And that's really what he did for a lot of these markets, was he facilitated transaction disagreements, if you will. And what was really cool about this is the federal agent actually noticed a book over his left shoulder. There's a book called Gomorrah. And there was, I believe, I can't remember the author's name, but the author's name had been discussed in some forum posts by Marcos Anibali and some other people. And he said, I've read that book. I have it. It's really great. Have you read this other book? And have you seen this and seen that? And so the federal agent that was looking at this picture actually noticed that. And basically that was sort of the smoking gun that, yeah, this is our guy. This is what he looks like. And just for good measure, of course, he was, basically had his password leaked in a password breach for Team Fortress. So the moral of the story is, whether you're doing good or bad on the dark web, it's probably not a good idea to start mixing up these identities. And if you do, in the course of your research, do find some interesting things like IP addresses and like real-world identities, like contact law enforcement and help us clean up this part of the web. So thank you. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy to take some. Cool.